Well, could you tell us a little more about the experiment that was named after you?
Oh, you mean the equation?
The equation, yes.
Yeah, well, one of the problems that you have in neutrino physics, and it was not just me, it was my colleague and myself, but one of the problems that you have in neutrino physics is trying to understand what the flux of the neutrinos are. Neutrinos are very weakly interacting particles. In fact, 100 billion neutrinos can go through a square centimeter of my hand right now. They go through the entire Earth without interacting because they're very weakly interacting particles. Now, it turns out that when you do a neutrino experiment, we can produce neutrinos in a way that is very, very controlled by assuming that all of the neutrinos come from the decay of kaons, which we talked about before, and pions, which is another type of meson. So if I take a proton beam, hit a target, and produce secondary particles of muons and pions and kaons, when the kaons and the pions decay, one of the decay products is the neutrino. So to be able to try to understand how many neutrinos you have if you're just looking at a neutrino beam of particles and looking at the interaction of those particles with your detector, you have to make some kind of conclusion, some kind of guess about how many neutrinos there are because very few of them interact. So what Raymond J. Stefanski and I did during my first years at Fermilab was to come up with an empirical formula that essentially would be based upon certain adjustable parameters, but an understanding that kaons and pions were the parents and most of the neutrinos came from those parents, and we would essentially make a measurement of all the kaons and pions in our beam and all of the muons that are the other associated decay product, and then use the kinematics of physics to determine where the neutrino was going to be produced. And we were extremely successful at this and put out a small, short paper saying that this is in fact how you would determine what the flux of neutrinos would be for all of the neutrino experiments at Fermilab and all the neutrino experiments at the Central European Laboratory in Switzerland. And this was a small thing, and I didn't think much of it at the time until I actually saw it written down in someone else's document to say, we use the flux formula of Stefanski and White to produce the flux estimations for our proposals for the experiments. And I think it took a number of years before I became fairly proud of that work. There were some problems with the formula, I have to say, but we adjusted those. And in fact, people have used that as a sort of a basis by which they can actually come up with neutrino fluxes in the future. But the idea, was the idea that this was not a great theoretical, it wasn't an E equal MC squared type thing. It was an empirical formula that was extremely practical. But you had to have this number to be able to do neutrino experiments. In fact, today, you still have to have the number. What we had done essentially was to provide a mechanism that was a lot more accurate than people had used for at least 50 years before that. And in fact, this was one of those things, as I said before, that I had done just before I went to Yale University.